It is a great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Dr. Pericles Lewis is Professor of Comparative Literature and English at Yale University, where he also serves as Vice President for Global Strategy and Vice Provost for Academic Initiatives. An accomplished scholar, Professor Lewis has contributed to studies of English modernism and comparative literature. But more recently, he is known for his work in internationalization of higher education. He served as founding president of the Yale National University of Singapore College, and in his current executive roles, he reports directly to the president and the provost, responsible for ensuring that the broader global initiatives of the university serve Yale's academic priorities. Professor Lewis has led the planning for establishment of such major initiatives as Yale's Jackson School of International Affairs and has contributed to development of the Yale Center Beijing and Yale Institute of Global Health. Professor Lewis's speech is titled Developing Yale's Global Strategy and Scientific Priorities. Please note that this presentation will be recorded and posted on YouTube. At the end, there will be a brief opportunity for questions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pericles Lewis.
Thank you very much, Professor Hebert. It's nice to see you on the screen and nice to see many others who've joined us. I hope you can all see my slides. I've titled the talk, Developing Yale's Global Strategy and Scientific Priorities. I have to say at the outset that I've spent the last decade or a little more than a decade on Yale's global strategies. I've been a little bit more of a spectator to our scientific priorities, but I am sort of engaged with those discussions. And so the second half will focus on that. I wanted to make it relevant to as many of you as possible, and I know that's a theme of the summer session. So let's see. I want to start with the question of what is a global strategy? Why does a university need to have a global strategy? I think it's a relatively new thing to do so. Although Yale has had students from around the world since the 19th century, it's only in the 21st century that we sort of technically developed a strategy. And I think the major reason for a strategy at a university, it is a little bit different at a private university like Yale than it might be at some public universities where the funding tends to be more top-down. I would say that at Yale, funding is located largely in the different schools of the university. So it's not a question where it's very simple for the university to just decide to, for example, close down one school and open another, or close down one department and open another. It's a much more complex relationship. And so the job of leading a university of that type is, complicated. I'm not trying to say that leading a public university is not also challenging. I know that it is. The challenges are just different ones. So what a global strategy at a university like Yale does is help to communicate the priorities of the university's leadership to both internal and external stakeholders. I'll talk more about who those stakeholders are later in the talk. It does guide allocation of resources. Again, that's a fairly complex matter at a university like Yale. And I think most importantly, it creates a signal to potential international partners, to international students, to faculty about the university's openness to collaboration. So just to give you a sense of Yale's international involvement at the moment, and of course, it wasn't this way when the strategy started 20 years ago. We currently have about 22% of all of our students coming from outside the United States. This isn't counting students who have a joint, for example, who are immigrants to the United States or students who have dual citizenship. This is just the students whose citizenship is purely non-US. That's about 3,000 students. There's a similar number of international scholars. These are mostly postdoctoral scholars in our medical school or in other research enterprises around the university. As the primary functions under international scholars shows, these are mostly researchers, but some do teaching as well. And the largest number of international students are in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, typically pursuing the PhD. But we have a substantial number in Yale College, which is the undergraduate branch of the university, and also in the schools of management and public health, and smaller numbers in the other schools of the university. The current plan for internationalization of Yale really started at the beginning of this century, which was the Yale was founded in 1701, so there was a celebration in 2001 of the tercentenary of the university, and our president at the time, Richard Levin, made the following remarks. Our efforts to create a global university start from the premise that the world has become increasingly interconnected, not simply economically and geopolitically, but also in the experience of daily life through the immediacy of events that are broadcast worldwide and through the confrontation of cultures, ideas, and values that are evident to all. And in the first decade of this century, the university created two separate but related international strategy plans with the goals of preparing students for leadership and service in an increasingly interdependent world and attracting the most talented students and scholars to Yale from around the world. So again, this started 20 years ago, and Yale has indeed changed a lot in the last 20 years. It's a place that evolves perhaps slowly, but it does evolve, and you really see the difference if you come now and you haven't visited for about 20 years or so. I want to say that in general, and this is applicable not just to Yale, but more broadly, in the first decade of this century, there was still a good amount of optimism about, I would say, internationalization and globalization, and that's when we founded the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization, for example, and everybody kind of anticipated a more global future. Of course, we remain very deeply globally interconnected, but after the 2008 financial crisis, and especially the rise of populist and nationalist leaders, not only here in the United States, but in other parts of the world that I won't, that you all know about, I think there has been a little bit less optimism in the last 5 years or the last decade. Now, the G7 are meeting in England, or have been meeting in England the past week or so, and there's some idea of a renewed spirit of international cooperation, and I'm hopeful about that. But I certainly, it was sort of an odd situation that I was given this job of being Vice President for Global Strategy in 2016. I believe that's the year that Brexit was approved, and later that year, President Trump was elected, and that made my job a lot more complicated. Once I actually started the job in 2017, it was a lot more complicated than what I'd anticipated in 2016, because the United States and other countries have been a little bit more resistant to international collaboration in the last few years in various ways. Those will come up later on. Now, as to, I mentioned specifically private universities, but I think there's some truth to this in public universities as well. The nature of academic research and teaching is really dependent on the bottom-up efforts of the faculty. The faculty are largely self-directed. They choose their own research agendas to a high degree. It's true that funding and other things can influence those decisions, but ultimately they're quite autonomous and indeed independent in how they work. I also think that in the time that I've been an academic, and say since the late part of the 20th century, faculty are relatively, in a country like the United States at any rate, faculty are relatively mobile. So it's not the case that you get a job, you finish your PhD at 28 or 30 or 32, you get a job and you stay there for 40 years. There are people who are in that situation still, but that's anomalous now. A lot more people move around for a variety of reasons. It's also the case that universities like Yale have multiple schools. We have about 14. And each school has its own set of priorities. So setting university-wide strategy has to intersect with the priorities of each of the schools. We'll come back to what Yale schools are later in the presentation. Nonetheless, I think that there are certain infrastructural and other kinds of support that the university as a whole, the central part of the university, can provide to enhance and to empower the faculty and the deans and the schools to pursue certain goals. So I'm focusing in the first part of the talk on the goal of internationalization, and in the second part of the talk on certain scientific goals that we have at Yale. So as to the history of internationalization at Yale, as I mentioned, 2001 is when the goal of making Yale a more global university was articulated. The following year, I'm sitting here in the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies, which is in fact an institution that goes back to the early 1960s and an earlier wave of interest in international studies. It consists of councils on various parts of the world. There's a council on European studies and several other councils on topics related to Europe. But the Major councils are on East Asian studies, African studies, Latin America, South Asia, and so on. In addition, there are centers on democracy, centers on the history of slavery, centers on mostly on international topics here within the Macmillan Center. And that was an opportunity or an effort to fund and support research of an international type across the university, especially in the humanities and social sciences, but to some extent also in the sciences and medicine. So 2002 was a gift that enabled the growth of the Macmillan Center and has resulted in attracting a lot of faculty who study the areas that I mentioned. I mentioned infrastructure, and that's what the next two bullets here refer to, the Office of International Affairs and the Office of International Students and Scholars. And David did suggest to me that, you know, you all come from a variety of different universities, and the question might be, well, what's the relevance to a university that's not as well-to-do or as highly ranked as Yale? I think the presence of the Office of International Affairs and the Office of International Students and Scholars were really key to Yale's global growth, and we've seen that our peer institutions here in the United States have generally followed suit. Some of them were ahead of us, of course, in creating such offices, and this is something to consider in whatever context you're in. The Office of International Affairs has the job essentially of negotiating our relationships with other universities, trying to help, whether it's a study abroad program, joint research, or other undertakings with another university. And the truth is, you need some kind of specialized knowledge, legal and knowledge about contracts and so on, in order to be able to operate internationally. So I think setting up the Office of International Affairs was very important in that regard. The Office of International Students and Scholars plays a somewhat more straightforward role, which is helping the students and scholars to get their visas, giving them legal advice, making sure they accord with all the laws and so on, and just helping them settle when they get to New Haven. And I think the creation of those two offices made a big difference for our ability to become a more international university, and is something that any university with international aspirations would want to have some similar kind of thing. Now, I will mention a little bit later on that President Salovey, who's pictured here in the middle of this group at the Yale Center Beijing, took office in 2013, and he had done a fair amount of work in Africa. He's a psychologist known for his work on emotional intelligence, and he had done a fair amount of work in Africa, especially South Africa, and was interested in expanding Yale's international collaborations with Africa. So this is an example where a central initiative led by the president results in sort of strengthening some of our African partnerships, which I'll mention a little bit later on. Likewise, you see him here at Beijing with some of our alumni and the then dean of our business school, Ted Snyder, founding the Yale Center Beijing in 2014. Yale has not got a lot of outposts in other parts of the world that just bear the Yale name, that are controlled directly by Yale, but Beijing, of course, is a very important place in the world, and I think Yale's relationship with China has always been very important to Yale. Yale is one of the universities with the oldest relationship with China in the West, and this center, which is in downtown Beijing, allows us to reach out to alumni as well as academics and government leaders in China, and it's been an important international venue for us. But we don't have very many of these, as I'll explain later on. So as I say, I was asked to do this job in 2016. President Trump was elected. I came back from Singapore in 2017, and I tried to set about analyzing what our global strategy should be in the years ahead. And so with a committee of faculty, I set these three broad aspirations: to be the university that best prepares students for global citizenship and leadership, to be a worldwide research leader on matters of global import, and to be the university with the most effective global networks. And we'll look at a little bit of what that means in the coming slides. When we were talking about how to analyze the university's international research and activities, we did look at the Sustainable Development Goals. And I know that's a major theme of your summer seminars. I will say that I found it very useful to read about and learn about the Sustainable Development Goals, and that our Office of Sustainability actually did a bit of a study of Yale faculty research to try and analyze what kinds of contributions are we making under each of these goals. We have a short report about that that's on the website if you're interested. On the other hand, I found that it was not that effective as an analytical method for understanding Yale research for the following reason. Yale is a university with a very strong and large medical school. So a very, very large fraction of all of our research fits under goal 3, which is good health and well-being. And our scientific strategy has a number of intersections with that theme of good health and well-being. Likewise, we have a good number of people, especially in our law school and in our social science departments, working on subjects relating to peace, justice, and strong institutions. But it was a little bit uneven. So, for example, although we have a strong environment school with people working on responsible consumption and production, and we, as I'll talk about later on, we have major efforts on climate action. We have relatively few people working on life below water, not none, but relatively few. And so it didn't seem that, it seemed a little bit like imposing a framework from elsewhere on the research that Yale's doing rather than, as I say, sort of trying to do it a little bit more bottom up. In setting the global strategy, by the way, and I'm about to turn to the scientific strategy, I will say that my technique was that I went around and I just met with the 100 faculty who are most involved in international research of different kinds or educational programs. And I met with the councils that I mentioned in the Macmillan Center. And then I went and met with the people in the medical school who are most engaged with international activities. So that, you know, it was just sort of finding out what people are doing and trying to craft around it what the major goals of the university should be. And in that regard, the Sustainable Development Goals helped me to understand the research, but I did not think that they were an effective way to analyze Yale overall. So I say that, I realize it may not be in the spirit of your summer school, but I wanted to be honest about it and happy to discuss that later on. It might be controversial. So in the context of our global strategy, we have founded 2 new institutions at Yale, which David mentioned in the introduction, which was, thank you, David, very generous. One is the Yale Institute for Global Health. We were very fortunate to attract Asad Omer, who is a distinguished epidemiologist from Emory in 2000. I think he arrived in 2019 to help us found the Yale Institute for Global Health. And this turned out to be incredibly important in the past year because Yale has been a leader in epidemiology over the past century, but particularly in the last, during this current COVID crisis, Saad and Albert Koh, who's also in the School of Public Health, Akiko Iwasaki in our biology department, and others have really made major contributions to understanding COVID and also to advising governments, including the Connecticut government, but also the United States government, several governments in Africa and Pakistan and so on COVID response. So I think this was just, in a sense, you know, good timing that we happened to open our Institute for Global Health and attract some excellent people just a little bit before COVID-19 hit. The Yale-Jackson School of Global Affairs is a new school at Yale. I mentioned that we have 14 schools at Yale. Most of them were founded either in the 19th century or the early 20th century. The most recent to be founded was the School of Management, which is about 50 years old. So it's a fairly unusual thing for us to found a new school. The Jackson School for Global Affairs started as the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs in 2009 with a gift from John and Susan Jackson. And when I came back from Singapore in 2017, the question was, should we expand it into being a school? The major difference between an institute and a school is that an institute, at least at Yale, the institute does not have its own faculty whose job is full-time in the institute. It borrows faculty from other institutes, other parts of the university. And an institute typically is more oriented towards research. That wasn't really the case with the Jackson Institute, but the typical meaning of institute is that it's focused on a particular research topic. We wanted the Jackson Institute to become something broader, to have its own faculty and its own control of its own programs. And so we created a faculty committee, which issued a report in 2018 and has proposed the creation of the Yale-Jackson School of Global Affairs. We're currently sort of preparing the buildings, hiring the faculty, raising the funds, and we expect the school to open next year. Happy to talk about that more in the discussion afterwards. I presented here also partly as an example of the role of faculty in establishing the global strategy. Again, each university is quite different. I think that in some parts of the world, it's common for the government, for example, to set certain priorities and say, well, you need to do more research on this area, or you need to provide continuing education or what have you, and to allocate the resources accordingly. In a private university, which is largely funded by gifts, endowments, and tuition, and to some extent medical income, those kinds of decisions are taken in a different fashion, and the faculty are really seen as partners in the leadership of the university. The president of the university, the provost, who's the chief academic officer, and I and several other people in the leadership, all of the deans are members of the tenured faculty. We participate in faculty discussions, and we don't, in general, undertake major initiatives without faculty input. So that leads to the science, in a moment that will lead to the science strategy. I'll just say briefly that this is a little map. When I got back, we created this map to show the range of engagements that we have. And if you go to our website, you can click on each of these little flags and see what we're up to. The different colors represent different types of international engagements. And these are examples of a few of the universities and foundations that we have partnerships with around the world. So David did ask me, what's the relevance to a university that's not, you know, an internationally known or highly ranked university or very wealthy university? I think if you are going back and working in your own Office of International Affairs or working with your own vice provost or what have you, you should think about identifying the faculty who have international experience and who can lead initiatives. I think having faculty leadership for initiatives is essential. I think identifying appropriate partners is important. An appropriate partner will often actually come from the faculty member who knows somebody at a relevant university. It could come from shared research interests. It could come from complementary research interests, where, for example, you have strength in one area and a partner overseas has strength in another. It could come from study abroad opportunities or exchanges. I think universities often tend, like I get a lot of letters, can you be a partner, can Yale be a partner with X university? I'm sure that a lot of universities that are in the top 50 universities ranking or whatever get a lot of those. I think it's not necessarily about collecting a list of elite universities that you're connected to. I think it's more about finding the ones where the partnership can grow and be strong. I also wanted to mention that while foundation support, the Macmillan Center that I mentioned was originally supported by the Ford Foundation here in the United States, foundation support is unlikely at this stage in history to pay, you know, a major fraction of the cost of internationalization. It can nonetheless be very important. The Gates Foundation is doing a lot of important work in Africa, the Wellcome Foundation if you're doing, or Wellcome Trust if you're doing medical research, and there are a lot of American foundations that are oriented towards universities and can be very helpful in setting up an international program. I want to give as an example of another country, now obviously a very wealthy country, but so is Norway, which is Singapore, their international strategy. And they worked very closely with a number of international universities in setting up their more international programs over the past 2 decades, starting with the Singapore Management University, on which they were advised by Penn, which has the Wharton School of Business. The conservatory at NUS was jointly founded with the Peabody Conservatory at Johns Hopkins, and then you'll see that Duke and MIT were partners in other setups at Singapore, followed by the Lee Kong Chan School of Medicine at Nanyang, which is one of the other universities in Singapore, was set up with Imperial College London, and most recently Yale-NUS College, which was, as David mentioned, a partnership between Yale and the National University of Singapore. The photograph, by the way, is the courtyard of Yale-NUS College. And when I lived there, my apartment was on the top of the building with the library. So it was quite a lovely place to live, although you had to be careful because these rocks can be quite slippery at certain times of day. It rains a lot in Singapore. Okay, I mentioned that President Salovey was inaugurated in 2013 and that one of his initiatives was the Africa Initiative. He also tried to identify university-wide academic priorities. I'll focus in the last few slides on the science strategy. I want to point out, this is the US News and World Report rankings. You have to be a little bit skeptical about rankings. You shouldn't live and die by them. Nonetheless, it turns out that they're important for at least 2 reasons. One is that they often do reflect how good your department is, although they may be a little bit out of date, or they may rely too much on reputation and not enough on actual accomplishment. But the second is that they have a big signaling effect. When students and faculty are thinking where they want to go, they tend to choose the third rated place over the fourth rated place, even if there's no real difference in quality between the third and the fourth. So it's relevant to students and to faculty. Yale is very highly rated in undergraduate education and law and all of the arts. These are not rated by this particular magazine, U.S. News and World Report, but our architecture, drama, and music schools are very good. We're strong, reasonably strong in business and medicine as well as law among the professional schools, and very strong in the humanities and social sciences. Our sciences are, of course, also strong, and biology is very connected to the medical school where we do a lot of research, but notably they're a little lower in the rankings than our humanities and social science departments. Our engineering department or engineering school is the lowest ranked of the group that I've put up here. Again, one doesn't want to put too much emphasis on rankings, but I give that as the context for our science strategy. I think there was a recognition at the top of the university that being 6th to 12th or being 38th was not quite adequate when many other parts of the university were in the top 5. And there is a problem there with allocation of resources. Science is extremely expensive to undertake nowadays. You need a lot of equipment, you need to pay salaries and so on. You need to support the applications for research grants. The university's resources are historically, Yale's resources are historically very much allocated, very well allocated to the humanities and social sciences. When we announced more investments in science, there was natural consternation on the part of people in humanities and social sciences saying, why are you spending all this money on science? And one could come up with a strategy, and in a way, Caltech is an example of that strategy, or MIT, where you just said, we're only going to focus on a part of this. We're going to be the best science university in the world. Or Yale could say, we're going to be the best humanities university in the world. But our feeling is not only that science is an important undertaking for all great universities, but also that a truly great university engages the arts, the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences, maybe not all at exactly the same level of quality. We don't want to be 7th best in everything, but I think that a truly vibrant campus and one that's really making contributions in the century, let's say, ahead, needs to be doing important work in science as well. And that's also important for our students. We don't want students to come and find subpar education in any field. And of course, one could imagine a strategy that just says, I won't choose any of these schools. But let's say you had a school of agriculture that wasn't doing very well. You could just imagine a plan to just shut it down. In fact, Yale did that back in the 19th century. We had an agriculture department that was just shut down at the end of the 19th century. But that's a pretty difficult, at a minimum, a very difficult, let's not, and a drastic step to take nowadays. So we focused on trying to develop a university-wide science strategy. There are several schools at Yale: arts and sciences, engineering, environment, medicine, public health, and so on, that have science in them. And the fairly typical thing at an American university is for each school to have its own strategy, each school with it, or faculty within the university to have its own strategy. Instead, the university aimed to get a strategy that would focus on, that would engage all of the schools that are doing scientific research and help to decide on investments in that way. The process was that this group of 15 or so senior scientists, who again come from the whole range of the university, under the leadership of Scott Strobel, who is now our provost and was then the vice provost for research, would identify areas in which Yale had both leadership potential. So you wouldn't necessarily choose, say you're particularly weak in some area. It does not make sense to invest in the place where you're weakest necessarily. It's hard to attract the most talented people in that area. You're unlikely to quickly rise in the rankings. And anyway, a rise in the rankings isn't the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to do good science. So instead, the idea was to choose areas that are both have big impact in the world, and that's where the Sustainable Development Goals are relevant, and also areas in which Yale already has some kind of leadership and where an additional investment would allow us to provide even greater leadership and hopefully, in a sense, raise the boats in the related departments as well. And so the science strategy identified the following 5 main priorities: data science and its mathematical foundations, quantum science and materials, neuroscience, inflammation science, and planetary solutions, which is about climate change and evolutionary and how it affects evolution and health on the planet. And as I say, the major considerations were where can Yale have the greatest impact and what is the feasibility of Yale having such an impact? In other words, do we have the requisite infrastructure and so on? During this period of developing the science strategy, we built a new science building just down the road here, which is a very large mostly biological sciences facility. There's some chemistry in there, some up here, there's a greenhouse. We filled it with very interesting equipment too. So I hope you'll get to come to New Haven and we'll arrange a tour for you. I'll end with just one of the priorities. It was listed fifth. I think the reason it was listed fifth is that at the time that the science strategy was unveiled a couple of years ago, we hadn't quite figured out what to do in this area. COVID did interrupt things a little bit. On the other hand, while COVID obviously was an immediate emergency, it also called attention for everybody, I think, to the importance of the issue of climate change as the longer term threat to human health in the world and to the health of the globe. So what happened during, and we ultimately had to do it mostly by Zoom, is that we had a number of sessions with a couple of hundred different scholars and scientists and social scientists as well and humanists working on environmental issues across campus. It was all set to launch just when COVID hit, so it wound up being delayed a little bit, and most of it happened during the past academic year, to identify areas in which Yale could make a contribution to resolving the challenges facing the planet. And one of the outcomes of this is a recent gift to create a center focusing on natural solutions for reducing our atmospheric carbon, but that is only one of the areas of the planetary solutions, and the project is really bringing together faculty in a number of areas of the university. In addition, the university has revised its investment policy and is organizing campus operations around this goal of zero carbon emissions through the use of an internal carbon charge that encourages different parts of the university to use less carbon. So I give that as an example where global strategy and science strategy come together, and as an example of how engaging the faculty in a discussion of what the priorities of the university are can result in, I think, opportunities for the university to do more than it could just on the basis of any individual researcher. So for example, it's very important at research universities in the United States to have leading centers that are federally funded. We have a lot of great scholars who have important reputations individually, but we have relatively few of these centers that are federally funded that typically support health-related research. I think the opportunity to bring people together has given us ideas for how to have a more coordinated approach to federal funding that will hopefully strengthen our science in the long run. So I realize it's a bit of a quick rush through our priorities. I'll just say that, as you've probably seen all through my talk, the role of the faculty is essential. Students, of course, come and go a little bit, but the ability to attract the best students is key to our endeavors. I think the engagement of staff and alumni, although the university is run essentially more by the faculty than by the staff, but with a lot of alumni contribution, I think that the feeling of engagement by the staff and alumni is very important. Obviously, we're quite dependent on financial support from donors. Foundations, as I say, are often important for establishing priorities although the financial contribution may be smaller, the signaling is highly relevant. And although we don't receive direct government subsidy for our general operations, a large fraction of our research is supported by research agencies of the federal government. So understanding the government priorities in research is extremely important. And there are lots of other ways in which government relations are crucial, which we could talk about as well. So that's an overview of what we've been up to, and I'm very happy to take questions and discuss. I'm going to take the slides down off the screen so I can see more of you and you can see each other. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Pericles Lewis from Yale University. So we now open the floor for questions. And what I would like the doctoral students in Bergen Summer Research School to do, if you have a question, you can type it into the chat here. So it gives me a chance to select questions, just so we're not completely overwhelmed with many questions at once. I see that we have one already here from Subir Rana. Subir's question: does internationalization of higher education have links with the notion of world-class universities? Is the ranking system a correct and ethical way of rating education? Just a moment. Rating educational institutions. If the educational infrastructure like labs and libraries become an index of judging educational spaces, then will it be correct to take the world as flat as Friedman would have us believe? Because then it fosters a mushrooming of private universities, which is the case in the global South, where higher education is not just costly and is, a very long question here, turned into a commodity, but also unthinkable for vulnerable and poorer sections of the society. I think that's the main point from that question. Please, any thoughts?
Thank you. It's very thoughtful. I'll just address three dimensions. One is the rankings issue, one is the educational issue, and one is the research issue. On the rankings, there's no doubt that rankings are problematic. They misstate things. They maybe put priorities in the wrong places. And every leader of a university will tell you that they don't really believe in the rankings. And nonetheless, it is true that the rankings are extremely powerful. So you could say, is it a good thing? Should we ignore them and so on? Nonetheless, they mean a great deal. And so you just can't reasonably ignore them, I think. That said, obviously only a tiny fraction of people are going to go to the elite universities that are on those lists. And so I think the question about education, which is sort of crucial to what you just read, David, is very true. A majority of students in the United States are educated by public universities. I think having good funding for public universities is extremely important. I think that in most countries that I've visited, most education is provided by the state, directly or indirectly, and I think that's likely to remain the case. I'm not super familiar with private universities outside the United States. The private nonprofits in the US are a rather unusual kind of thing. Places like Yale have been around since before the country was founded, and they're, although they are, yes, private, they were set up by government charter, and they're more like a municipality in some sense than they are like a private corporation in the way that they function. And I realize that that privatization of universities may be controversial in some parts of the world, I'm somewhat agnostic as to whether the sources of funding should be private or public, insofar as I think that the best thing is to educate as many people as possible, and some of that will be through people paying tuition, and some will be through government funding, and I hope the governments will fund them well. Now, that said, when it comes to research, I think there is something about scientific research, especially, and to some extent humanistic research too, that depends on some kind of concentration. In other words, people want to be around the other scholars who are doing the top work. They want to have access to the libraries, and especially in science, they want certain kinds of equipment. And the equipment turns out to be incredibly expensive. So it is probably the case that the need to use certain kinds of equipment will likely lead to some concentration of scientific talent in the places that can afford that kind of equipment. There are, CERN and all of the astronomical observatories tend to be done by a sort of a consortium approach, but a lot of equipment is going to be purchased by individual universities. On the other hand, and in the more democratizing direction, it used to be that you had to come to the library to some great library to get all the books you would want. Now, increasingly, books are available and articles are available online so that you can access them from various places. There are still concerns about copyright and so on. So it's not like it's become totally democratized, but much more so than it was 30 or 40 years ago. So I hope that addresses some of those questions.
Thank you. We have a question from Hua from Vietnam. And this has to do with the fact that in many countries or regions of the world, there are no universities that are ranked in the top 100, for instance. Mm-hmm. And so Hua's question is, how has Yale established its partnerships with universities that are not well funded in the top 100, as in the case of the National University of Singapore?
Mm-hmm. So typically, where we work with universities in, say, the Global South, it tends to be that a faculty member at Yale has a good relationship. So I'll take as an example Makerere University in Uganda, which I visited just a little bit before the COVID pandemic hit. And that started out with an exchange of students coming from Uganda to the US and faculty going out to Uganda to offer courses and so on. And it built its way into a long-lasting partnership. And my colleague who sort of inherited from her professor this relationship took me on a tour of Makerere's medical school and hospital. And every office, somebody would come out and say, "Hi, Tracy, nice to see you again," and so on, because so many people had either been from New Haven to Kampala or the other direction that it was like a very close and integrated relationship. How it was chosen originally, I think that had to do with, essentially personal faculty relationships, but over time, and again, with some foundation funding, it developed into a really close working relationship. And I think that kind of partnership is what should be aimed for, rather than sort of a one-off thing where you just say, "Oh, well, we'll send 3 students and you send 3 students." I think instead, people with shared interests and an ability to work closely together can build up a relationship that can have a long-lasting impact. And we have similar relationships with Sao Paulo, for example, and it does tend to be the leading university in a given country in the nature of things, but not necessarily. You know, we have relationships with a range of universities around the world.
We have students asking a few practical questions about your admissions criteria and about whether you have postdocs in particular fields. But one question here that I think is more general. Annetta from Alabama asks, what role does Yale play in helping local communities where partnerships are established?
Well, that's a good question. So as I say, a very large fraction of our research, at least half, is in medical areas. And of course, some of that is, in the lab or working with patients here in New Haven. But that's one of the reasons we founded the Yale Institute for Global Health, is that we had a lot of health projects in India, in East Africa especially, but in West Africa as well, and in South Africa, in China, and in many, many other parts of the world. I already mentioned Brazil. And all of these involve typically clinical kinds of things. So another example is I was in Ethiopia, and we have a program. This was before the current civil war unrest. We have a program that helps to train people who run local health clinics on management techniques. So it's basically a health management kind of program. And we have an in-country team that offers this training locally. And in fact, it had at one point 5 or 6 different outposts in different parts of Ethiopia. I didn't get to go very far, but I went to a rural clinic just outside Addis Ababa. And basically, the local doctor who just serves the local community had been trained in, how do you keep records? How do you allocate vaccines, all these kinds of things. And I think it seemed to have pretty good benefits. It was funded by the Gates Foundation. Some of our other work there tends to be funded by the USAID, the US Agency for International Development. Unfortunately, I think the Gates Foundation funding disappeared in that particular case. So, but there are a lot of other projects of that type all around Africa. I mentioned Africa just because I traveled there a couple of years ago, but there are examples in other parts of the world as well.
One student is asking about concerns for the carbon footprint of travel. This is Erin who's asking this, and about the harm that's caused by travel even for academic purposes. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think that's a real concern. I don't quite know what the solution to it is. We have, up until now, tended to invest in carbon offsets to try and reach net zero in our carbon footprint, but there's a limit to how far these carbon offsets are really going to solve the problem. I mean, they might slow the expenditure of carbon, and of course, travel is one of those areas. I mean, airplane travel is one of those areas where you can't just replace it with renewables. They haven't figured out a solar powered airplane yet. So I think this is a real issue. I don't know the answer to it. I think there is a much value in our international collaborations, and I think there's some things that can't be done as well on Zoom. I think if we were all in Bergen, we would learn more from each other than we can, even though I'm sure you're doing a great job with the program nonetheless, and likewise, we have a lot of international programs that have switched to Zoom, and we will probably keep using Zoom or programs like it for some of those. But I do think in some areas, it's impossible to do equally well without the face-to-face. I think, for example, of that training in Ethiopia, most of which is done by our Ethiopian staff. But if you didn't have the Yale doctors and management experts flying out there and participating, I think the quality would be lower. And so I think there is a certain kind of trade-off there. And I don't know how to, I suppose you could price it in by taxing air fuel more highly, and that would at least cause people to travel somewhat less and think about the cost a little bit more directly. That might be one approach to it, but I don't know the answer.
Yeah, it sounds like online learning is one solution, at least for reducing the problem.
Sure, and it may also increase access. We're growing our online programs for that reason, but I don't think they're going to be everything, if you know what I mean.
Right, right. We have a question from Lithuania. This is from Monica Udachova. She says, since Yale University is a prominent university on the global scale, how do you as an institution reconcile the power imbalances, including epistemic power imbalances, between Yale University and its partners?
Well, we look at our partnerships, as equal partnerships. We don't look at them as us having the epistemic expertise or whatever, and they're not having it. Now, that said, there are obviously areas, we have a medical school with a long history. We bring experts from all around the world. It's a very international place. And so obviously there is knowledge that people would like to have in other parts of the world, and we want to share it. We're not about making money from sharing that knowledge. We're about just trying to find partnerships that will work. The partnerships do vary in type. If you have a partnership with a Norwegian or a Singaporean or a British university, you're dealing with partners who have similar resources to your own. If you're dealing with universities or students in other parts of the world, obviously the resource imbalance is much more pronounced. But we just try and look at it as a partnership in which, we're equals, and we don't take the fact that we have more resources to mean that we have more wisdom. We may have certain specific kinds of expertise that other places want to get access to.
Thank you. That's helpful. And we have a question from Kofi. I believe Kofi is from Nigeria. The question is, does goodwill matter in the kind of university one attends?
That's
a wide
great.
Open question.
Yeah, I can't tell if that's a question about the student or Kofi's saying he's from Ghana. We
Ghana.
have good partnerships with the university in Ghana too. I don't know that it is whether it's a question about the student or about the university. I think a university depends very highly on goodwill, the reputation of a university, and unfortunately, relatively isolated incidents. And we've had a few, we have them every year, but we had a few just in the last couple of weeks, can have an outsized effect. You're doing all the great work you can, and then one person, let's say a faculty member or a student or something, does something really outrageous or awful, and that affects the reputation of everybody else at the university. So that's just a difficult fact of modern life and social media. From the student's point of view, I think, you want to go to a university that wants you as a student. So that's obviously important. And you can usually tell whether the university wants you as a student by whether it treats you well. I do think reputation in your home country is probably pretty important. Although a lot of people come to the US with the intention of working here after they graduate, still many people also go back to their home countries after studying in the US. And so thinking about, well, how does the reputation of the university back home, what will that impact be? And I've certainly talked to students who, in considering a university, have that very much in their minds. That's a little bit more reputation rather than goodwill. I do think the goodwill question also goes back to the earlier question about partnership. You can't have a partnership based on where the, on condescension or something like that. It has to be based on mutuality.
Great. And we have a question from Aya from the Philippines. She asks, how has the pandemic impacted international collaborations, and how do you envision future collaborations in this light?
And that's a great question. Well, as I say, we did a lot of work related to COVID that was international. And so in that limited sense, it actually strengthened some of our relationships internationally. Professor Omer, Dr. Omer, and others advised governments overseas, and some of the Chinese universities advised us because they'd seen more of COVID before we did. So that was, in that regard, the international partnerships were very important. I think the other thing is that we have a number of programs, especially sort of leadership programs for people in mid-career. Our African Women Leaders Program, the biggest of them is the Greenberg World Fellows Program. We have a couple with Chinese partners, and these all had to change to being online. That has a plus. I mentioned having the most effective global networks. The fact that you're able to reach people on Zoom if they're willing to do it at the right time zone means that relationships that you might normally only visit once a year, now you can several times a year have sessions together and so on. On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, it's nice to actually have a meal with somebody and have an informal conversation in the hallway. And it's much harder to replicate that on Zoom. So I think that likely we will have an increased amount of online activity, but we'll still have what we call high touch programs where people actually come to New Haven, or where people from New Haven actually go to other partner institutions around the world, because I do think that there's some kind of learning and development of relationships that can only happen in person.
Martha Nussbaum, the philosophy professor with University of Chicago, she's recently been awarded the Holberg Prize here in Bergen for her contribution.
I was afraid you're going to say that she was in the audience, but it sounds like you're just quoting.
She could very well be. We actually tried to invite her to Bergen Summer Research School as well. But she's here for the Holberg Prize. It's quite an honor, and I'm sure you're familiar with her work. One of her concerns about higher education is the future role of humanities fields and liberal arts. Mm-hmm. And I know it's something that you write about as well. You've written about liberal arts in Asia and in other parts of the world. And maybe you could tell us a bit about what you see as the importance of liberal arts within universities in general, and your thoughts about their future role.
Thank you, David. So I'm going to distinguish humanities education and liberal arts education. The humanities, whether it's art, music, literature, philosophy, and so on, are essential parts of understanding human nature, and I think they're essential parts of an education. I think every scientist can benefit from learning something about the humanities, just as every humanistic scholar can benefit from learning something about science or about quantitative methods and so on. Specifically as to liberal arts education, the way we use that phrase in the United States refers to the fact that, unlike many parts of the world, we don't require students to specialize when they arrive as an undergraduate. Instead, we expect them to spend 1 to 2 years exploring a range of fields. And the articles you mentioned, David, that I've written, and Yale-NUS College in Singapore and some other schools that I've visited, have an emphasis on delaying specialization a little bit. And I do think that the model that is common around the world, and that I think was probably developed in the early 20th century, of relatively early specialization, I think it has its downsides. I'm not saying that I'm against it always, but one of the things I like about the way we do it at Yale and the way we do it at Yale-NUS is that the students have a little bit of time to explore a range of fields, and the science students are required to learn something about philosophy or literature or art or music, and vice versa. And I think that does encourage a more well-rounded kind of education that has some value, and that's sort of what I tend to write about in those areas. It is akin to Professor Nussbaum's point in the sense that I talk about the role of undergraduate education in forming a young person's character, in preparing them for citizenship, and helping them to learn to live in a community. I think the emphasis here is on the fact that there are areas beyond just the content of the courses that are important in the undergraduate experience. They're probably important in graduate experience too, but I've focused on undergraduate liberal arts education in my work. So I do think I've seen a few examples in the Netherlands and at University College London of efforts to have a little bit more interchange between the arts and sciences and a little bit broader based undergraduate education. And personally, I admire those. By the way, I myself had a relatively narrow education at McGill University in Canada, which was focused entirely on English literature. And so part of my preference for the US system is my sense that I wish I'd studied something besides, although I love English literature, I wish I'd studied a few other topics as well when I was an undergraduate.
We have several questions. It's difficult to prioritize here. One of them perhaps you could tackle quite quickly, and that is, what is Yale doing to tackle the problem of poverty around the world?
Well, we have a number of researchers who are focused on the problem of poverty, and in particular, we have a strong history in development economics. We have a master's degree program, and we bring a lot of people here who are working in developing countries on economics issues, and we've recently enhanced our development economics program with the hiring of Rohini Pandey. So we certainly have some, and Mushfiq Mubarak is another who's done a lot of very influential work on poverty alleviation around the world. So it's definitely an area. I mean, that's work where the job of the university, I feel, is to support the research of the faculty who are the experts in the area. So the university itself doesn't cure cancer. The university hires faculty who search for a cure for cancer, if you see what I mean.
And I'd like to close with a question from Henry Hansen. What would you suggest to researchers in the Global South to make their work more impactful and visible to researchers in the Global North in order to build new partnerships?
That's a great question. I think if you're looking at the individual level, I think participation in conferences, which now can increasingly be done by Zoom, obviously publishing in leading places, and seeking out opportunities like the summer school are all great ways to do that. If you're looking at it from an institutional level, a university level, again, going back to the idea of the Office of International Affairs, having an effort to build on whatever existing international relationships exist in order to develop them and further them. I think you'll find that countries like Norway and the United States and Singapore that have a lot of resources, although understandably there may be resentment of the wealth of those countries, I also think there's a lot of goodwill in those countries and willingness and eagerness to engage with the Global South. So I think there are a lot of opportunities there, but I admit that they may be challenging to find, and these are all, selective by nature. So, if you're applying to programs, you probably want to put in a lot of applications, but I think there are a lot of opportunities there. And I think while I started with a bit of a note of pessimism, having experienced, 4 years of xenophobia in the United States, I do feel that, in a way, this most recent crisis has made us all aware of how interconnected we are. And that's why I'm more optimistic, for example, about tackling climate change than I was a couple of years ago. So maybe I can leave it on an optimistic note.
Thank you so much, Professor Pericles Lewis from Yale University.
Thanks for having me, David, and everybody.